hands up! I swear to God! Push your hands up! You put it in park!
When deputies walk out of their houses for duty every morning, they know that things might not always go as planned. They could be chasing a dangerous criminal who could end up firing at them, or they could become victims of a case of road rage. The same was the case for a Seminole County sheriff's deputy. He saw a man breaking traffic law and pulled him over, but he wasn't ready for what happened next. His body cam footage captured the altercation between him and the perpetrator and how he had almost lost his life while on duty. Let's take a look at how the incident unfolded that day. In 2019, Seminole County Officer Aaron Blay was on patrol near the ramp to I-4 from County Road 46A when he noticed a car with heavily tinted windows. He approached the car to give the driver a warning and check the percentage of tint on his windows. But the situation soon went downhill, leaving the officer severely wounded. Body cam footage collected from the officer showed the exact moment the altercation took place. The officer approached the car and politely asked the driver to put the back window down so that he could check it.
Howdy! You mind putting down the back window, please, for me?
The man complied. The deputy then introduced himself. The man looked confused and slightly panicked, and so the officer quickly told him that he was being pulled over because his windows were dark and it was nothing too serious.
All right, awesome. I'm Deputy Blazer with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office. Before I ask you for any information, the reason I'm pulling you over is because your windows up here are way too dark.
The officer wanted to check how heavy the tint was, so he asked the driver to roll up his windows halfway up. He then brought out his meter and checked the window.
First at you? Okay. So if you could do me a favor, just roll this window about halfway up. That's good.
Then, the officer explained the law of the state of Florida, where a window can have a certain percentage of tint, and anything above that is illegal. He also told him what the reading on his meter meant.
So in the state of Florida, the front window can be 25%, back window can be 15%, okay? The lower the number, the darker the tint.
He then informed the man that his window was way too dark than the acceptable limit. In fact, it was nowhere near it. The man kept saying that he thought his black window was all right. But the officer showed him the reading once again and explained that it was way darker than what was allowed.
Your front window is measuring at 3%, okay? So
I thought it went by the back window. I thought.
No. So as you can see, 3. What that means is only 3% of the outside ambient light is getting through your window.
The officer then followed the protocol and asked the man to show his license and other documents. He said he could provide them and reached for the papers.
Do you have your driver's license, registration, proof of insurance?
He then started laughing as he handed over his papers.
Living the dream.
I see you on the trail. Look like what the hell happened.
2513.
The officer checked his information and mentioned that the papers were close to their expiration, but still had some time before it could be called illegal. His name was Rocky Rudolph. The officer asked him to change the expired documents as soon as possible.
This is the registration right here.
Okay.
It's saying it's, I guess, your birthday's probably on the 5th.
Is it?
Yeah. So ultimately, it's technically expired,
Yeah.
but we don't cite for that. There's case law that says it goes to the end of the month.
Yeah.
So you need to get that changed.
Rudolph assured the deputy that he would get it changed. He believed that the issue at hand was sorted. But the officer told him that he could smell weed inside his car. He asked Rudolph if he had been smoking pot. But he replied that he was only smoking what he had in his hands, and it was a black and mild smoke.
Mr. Rudolph, is there any reason why there would be a hint faint of weed coming out of your vehicle? Do you smoke? Do you have any friends that smoke? Anything like that?
Just back when I was second.
The officer told him that he knew the difference between a black and mild smoke and weed. He asked Rudolph if he had any weed in his car. He said he didn't.
No, I know the difference between black and mild smoke and this and that. Do you have any marijuana in the car? Okay.
The officer was certain that he was lying because the stench of weed was very strong at this point. So he asked him again if there was no weed in the car, he said he didn't. Now, to make things safe for both of them, Deputy Blay asked Rudolph to shut the car and put it in park. He complied without asking any questions.
So there's no marijuana in the car at all? Okay. All right. Can you do me a favor and just shut the car off for me?
Rudolph appeared unhappy and was fussing. However, the officer explained that he already didn't have the valid papers, and on top of that, his car smelled like weed. He said he didn't care about the weed, but he needed to conduct a regular check before he could let him go. He had already called his peers to come assist him, and they were on their way.
Huh? Well, I smell marijuana, and you don't have a card, so I'm not. Listen. I'm not concerned with some personal use stuff, man. It doesn't even warrant my time.
The deputy then noticed that Rudolph still hadn't shut off his car. He asked him to follow his instructions. He sounded upset and kept arguing with the officer, saying that he was not smoking weed and it was only a black and mild. The officer reminded him that he knew what he was doing and requested him to comply with his demands.
Would you mind shutting the car off, please? Huh?
I'm smoking a black and white.
I understand. Just shut the car off for me, please. Okay?
The deputy quickly asked where his peers were and asked them to try to arrive quickly. He then noticed that Rudolph was getting even more impatient and upset every minute, and the deputy told him that it wasn't that serious and was just a routine procedure. But Rudolph started complaining about the deputy taking his license for weed when he wasn't even smoking it. And then, he appeared to be reaching out for his wheel. The officer noticed and tried to calm him down.
All right. 2513, Seminole. Step him up, please. It's no big deal. I mean, I'm not.
You gonna take me from a license to marijuana, bro?
Listen. Give me.
The officer asked him to stop and just stay there for him, but Rudolph already had his hands on the wheel. The deputy grabbed his seatbelt and pulled on it because he knew that he would try to drive away. As the officer started to yell, Rudolph threw out his hands and tried to protect himself against the officer.
Do me a favor. I'm telling you right now.
The officer had no other option but to pull the gun to stop him from resisting the procedure. Rudolph saw the gun and he started panicking. The officer kept asking him to put his car in park and put his hand up. He still suspected that he would drive away.
Stop! Put it in park! Put your hands up!
The audio was redacted in this part of the footage, but it's clear that Rudolph is trying his best to convince the officer that he didn't do anything, while the officer kept asking him to put his hands up. Rudolph cried and mumbled, doing everything other than putting his hands up.
Sir, I'm telling you! Put your hands up!
The officer had reached his tipping point. He sounded stricter when he asked Rudolph to put his hands up. He repeated it a few more times, but he showed no sign of complying.
Put your hands up! Put your hands up! I swear to God! Put your hands up!
Rudolph suddenly did the unthinkable. He reached out and swatted the officer's hand away, and then he started driving. The officer tried to hold him back, but he kept shoving him away and drove off. Deputy Blay fired at him once and got his leg. But he couldn't keep up with the car and fell to the ground.
You put it in park! Sir!
A different camera showed Rudolph driving away hurriedly to escape the scene. The officer could be seen hanging onto the window and dragged on for a few seconds before he crashed onto the sidewalk. The impact sent him rolling onto the ground. Rudolph took a sharp turn and left the scene, leaving the officer on the ground. Another car parked right where he dropped, and a man was seen coming out to check on the deputy. The footage ended here, but the case didn't. The deputy was rushed to the hospital, and the sheriff's office pressed attempted homicide charges against Rudolph. News reporters picked up the incident and published the footage. They had another angle which showed how the officer had been dragged before being dumped on the ground.
Tonight, a driver is facing an attempted murder charge after this routine traffic stop turns into an officer's terrifying ride from the side of an SUV.
I'm telling you right now!
And from this angle, It appeared that the officer drew out his gun because Rudolph had tried driving away from the scene not once, but twice. After his first attempt, the officer pulled out the gun, but that didn't stop him, and he managed to drive away during his second attempt.
Watch as Seminole County Deputy Aaron Blaze is dragged twice, clutching onto the side of the car as it speeds away, hanging on for dear life.
This camera showed that Rudolph dragged the officer for at least 20 feet during his first attempt to flee.
38-year-old Rocky Rudolph seemingly becoming agitated and then seen dragging the deputy 20 feet the first time.
After he saw that the officer wasn't letting go, and he ran the risk of harming him and also himself if the officer fired, Rudolph stopped for a brief moment. But he eventually changed his mind and drove away, this time dragging the deputy for at least 100 feet. And this time, the officer opened fire, and the bullet hit him in the leg.
Rudolph stopped briefly, then is seen dragging the deputy again.
Push your hands up! You put it in park!
This time for 100 feet, his body cam falling to the ground, with the deputy managing to shoot Rudolph in the leg.
Sheriff Dennis Lemma of the Seminole County Sheriff's Office held a press conference after this incident and called Rudolph a bad person for harming the deputy in this way.
This is a bad dude who almost killed one of our deputy sheriffs on the side of the road.
He claimed that Rudolph was also carrying a weapon, but didn't elaborate on it.
The sheriff saying Rudolph was also armed. You can see the deputy fall from the car before Rudolph drove off.
Officers took only 8 hours to find Rudolph and take him into custody. He was also taken to the hospital for his leg injury.
And when 8 hours later, police were able to catch up with Rudolph, they took him into custody. He was taken to the hospital with a leg wound.
The deputy was released from the hospital by then, and luckily, was in good health. The final hearing of this case took place in February 2024. After long hours of the hearing, Rudolph was found guilty, but of a charge that was less serious than the one he was initially charged with. Official reports said, the man accused of dragging a former Seminole County Sheriff's deputy during a traffic stop was found guilty of attempted manslaughter, avoiding the more serious charge of attempted murder of a law enforcement officer. But that's not it. He also had multiple other charges against him that were proven in the hearing, and the list is pretty long. Jurors also found Rocky Rudolph guilty of aggravated battery of a law enforcement officer, possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, resisting an officer without violence, fleeing, attempting to elude, attempting to deprive an officer of protection communication, and possession of cannabis. The trial took 3 days to be completed. The state called the incident deliberate. Prosecutors claimed that Rudolph was intentionally trying to harm former Deputy Aaron Blay during the traffic stop incident, and their argument was pretty strong. The defense says the only thing their client did wrong was he didn't turn the car off. No, he didn't turn the car off, and he tried to drive off with Deputy Blaze still on the car, said attorney Gino Feliciani. However, the defense claimed that Rudolph was scared after the deputy pulled out a gun. He was fearing for his life and wanted nothing but to escape the situation. In fact, he was the one with a bullet wound and not the deputy. Only one person who tried to murder anybody, and that's Deputy Blaze, who tried to shot my client in the head, said the defense. After both parties presented their statements and claims, the jury made their decision and stated that they had identified the reason behind Rudolph's actions at the crime scene. State Attorney Phil Archer released a statement after the court session. I want to commend this jury for recognizing that attempting to avoid arrest by using violence towards an officer is always a crime. Too often these incidents turn deadly, and I'm thankful this one didn't. Hopefully this conviction sends a clear message that you won't avoid jail. You'll get more time in it. A lot more if someone gets hurt, the statement read. They kept Rudolph in jail without bond until his sentencing. And then on February 14, 2024, he finally received his sentence. According to reporters, he got a lesser punishment than what he actually deserved, but his family wasn't happy with it.
Rocky Rudolph could have gotten life in prison. Instead, the judge gave him 30 years, and still his family was furious.
Addressing the court, Rudolph said that he intended to be more respectful toward law enforcement, who only try to maintain law and order in society. He claimed he just wanted to go home, and that he never wanted to hurt the officer intentionally.
I just want to apologize for my unintentional actions. I didn't mean any harm, you know, to the officer.
He admitted that he had panicked, which caused the incident to escalate so much. He said he wanted to go to Officer Blay and apologize to him for his actions, and that he had already done it.
You know, my actions led me, you know, to panic. I just like to apologize to the officer, which I have. Well, the utmost respect for law enforcement and the law that they apply.
Prosecutors told reporters that instead of attempted murder, the jury had found them guilty of attempted manslaughter. He also had a number of other charges.
Prosecutors wanted the jury to convict him of attempted murder, but instead last month they found him guilty of a lesser charge, attempted manslaughter plus battery on a law enforcement officer.
They argued that Rudolph had a turbulent life filled with crime, and looking at the history, he should be kept behind bars for the rest of his life. However, the judge gave him a fixed set of years in prison.
The state attorney's office today asking the judge to sentence Rudolph as a habitual offender because he has several previous convictions in other cases that could have gotten him life behind bars, but the judge gave him 30 years.
His family members weren't really happy with the sentence. Rudolph's sister-in-law, Terenza Hamilton, claimed that Rudolph had already been to jail and served his time when he committed those other crimes, and those shouldn't have affected this sentencing. They also called a 30-year jail time ridiculous.
We need his help. We need him out here. And then you go back on his past of all the things that he have done. He served his time for it. So he does have a right to be back out here. 30 years? That's ridiculous.
She added that Rudolph was very sincere with his apology in court, and she didn't understand why, despite being so polite, honest, and upfront about it, he was still given 30 years jail time.
He was sincere with his apology. He meant that, and he said it. So I don't understand.
She said that the case was 5 years old, and Rudolph wasn't sitting at home during this period. He was in prison already going through punishment, and on top of that, he didn't need another 30 years. She claimed that the body cam footage collected from the officer clearly showed that he was in fear, which pushed him to act irrationally. He didn't have malicious intent, which is why 30 years in prison was never justified.
He don't deserve 30 years. And clearly on the video, you can see that he was in fear. Yeah, he did commit a crime, but he don't deserve 30 years for it. He done did almost 5 years in the county jail for that.
However, prosecutor Gino Feliciani claimed that given Rudolph's history of criminal records, the long sentence was the only way to ensure that he didn't repeat them and become harmful to civilians.
He has committed 20 felony crimes over a 20-year period of time. Would absolutely have committed more crimes.
According to him, his records go back to the late 90s, back when he was a juvenile, and he continued his crime into his adult years.
And his criminal record that goes back to 1997. So he started committing crimes when he was a juvenile, continued until he was an adult.
He had already been to prison many times for those crimes. On top of that, he had been found guilty of multiple charges during this hearing, so he wasn't pushed into jail for nothing. In fact, the judge had been lenient when sentencing him.
He's already gone to prison for at least 2 of the charges that he was found guilty of by the jury. It is not an excessive sentence. He could have gotten life in prison.
He added that he believed justice was served, and the sentence actually sent a message to the other lawbreakers that no matter how big or small their crimes are, they would never escape the clutches of law.
Yeah, I think justice was served today. I think it sends a message to the community that you need to, watch what you're doing. And
he added that this hearing would help restore faith in law enforcement and add value to the work they did every day by risking their lives.
And it also puts some value on law enforcement who risk their lives every day to protect the citizens of this community.
Rudolph's defense attorney claimed that when the police asked you to stop, you would likely stop based on the rule book. But it rarely happened in the real world because every person was different and had their own thought processes.
In a textbook, in some schoolyard or some schoolhouse, you're supposed to stop, listen to the officer. He says stop, you stop the car.
He said that law enforcement already had a bad reputation when it came to handling the black community, and so Rudolph couldn't trust him from the beginning. In fact, he spent 7 minutes trying to comply with the officer.
But in the harsh reality of 2020, 2019, with what we know is going on the streets and the unfortunate lack of trust for law enforcement, when Mr. Rudolph is there, in his mind, 7 minutes of trying to comply with everything he can do to comply with the officer's request.
However, he started reacting when the officer seemed to find more reasons for holding him back and eventually pulled out his gun. The defense attorney called it aggressive.
And then it turns into maybe you have pot in the car. Then if you grab my seatbelt and I sit in my car, that's an aggressive move in my opinion. I'm probably going to react to it, and I'm not a young black male looking down the barrel of a .45 caliber.
He acknowledged that it must have been difficult for his client, but he had to make a decision in that split second.
So yeah, I'm sure that it was very frustrating for Mr. Rudolph to do exactly what he did, was decide, I could die here, I have to leave.
However, the court had already decided his fate, and Rudolph didn't have an escape this time. A small, impulsive act landed Rudolph in lifelong imprisonment. If he'd only listened to the officer and complied with his orders, the officer would likely let him leave after checking his car. Now he would spend the rest of his life in prison, thinking what would have happened if he'd cooperated with the officer that day. This case remains an example for all the other lawbreakers out there. Sometimes we have to trust the officers and do as they say. Unless we have something to hide, it's highly unlikely that they would hurt us in any way. So, what did you think of this case? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.